It's been 21 years. I've been feeling the opportunity to tell my brother's story because of the fact nobody else would dare touch it. I feel like everything was in vain. I'm sure he wanted all said like it should be said instead of people speculating in the way that they did, because I did love my brother. He was my baby brother, and I loved him dearly, regardless of how things was in the end. It should be told, and told the true way.
We never really had a sound.
This is the mic right here. We're in the heart of Richmond, VA.
They got gangs, roaches.
Yes, it was the deadliest invasion since the Civil War.
Killers, dope.
Drug-related shootings in Richmond.
We knew what we couldn't do, so we were forced to be original.
Now today, I want to introduce you to a man named Mark Arlo Sheppard, who was born on April 1st, 1971 in Richmond, Virginia. The early memories of Mark would be that of a cool, average little kid, very shy, standoffish, and you could tell he had somewhat of a learning problem. And this was mostly due to him having self-esteem issues.
Very quiet little boy, very reserved. He didn't never cause any problems. Only thing he wanted after school was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Every time he would come to the house, he'd ask my sister, "Can I get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich?" We used to tease him with that.
Now Mark, he shared a father with his brother Leon, but they would have separate mothers. Their father was a man who married multiple times and also ran his own business as a general contractor. So he was almost always busy, always working long hours. So it's safe to say that quality time with dad was almost non-existent. And most wouldn't begin to understand how important the fatherly role is until you either lose said father, grew up without one, or the father you have is there, but he's not at the same time. Every one of those scenarios can almost guarantee a switch in the child's behavior once the puberty stages come into play. He would grow up on the north side of Richmond off of First Avenue in Highland Park. And he had always lived with his mother, but due to her also not being home much, he was being cared for by his brother's sister through most of his childhood.
When Mark was a little boy, his mom didn't have a babysitter for him. My sister became the babysitter. They came to my house, watched him until she got off work like about 6 o'clock. She took that chore on because she always kept kids, and she kept them for a few years. My mom and dad had just broke up and was divorced, and that's when my dad went with his mother. Then my dad left his home. Things started getting a little different. You know how kids be when it's a divorce, things go awry.
By the late 1970s, he's just another young black kid growing up in Richmond, Virginia. And while attending school, he was fine. Nothing out of the norm at all. It was a situation where Mark felt as if the teacher wasn't listening to his pleas or his requests, so he would then lash out. Now, the first time Mark would see a jail cell or anything remotely related to incarceration would be at 10 years old after he would break the jaw of his teacher.
Somebody was picking on him, and the teacher didn't come to his defense. He just got frustrated and lost it. That's when actually the help should have been gotten, because that tells you something right then and there if he was that hot-headed to do that. He was crying out early, but nobody paid attention and took the signs. That was the first real big trouble when he got sent to juvie for the first time. They put him out of school, and then I think, of course, because it's a teacher, different type of charges were pressed. It won't no just in-school suspension and set him out of school for a few days. It wasn't even like that.
But it was the transition to junior high that would activate that mischievous behavior brewing inside him all along. By now, Dad was still a workaholic. His older sister still kept a watchful eye over him and his brother most days. But that was only up until he turned 12 years old. So even though both parents were present, neither of them would be as involved as Mark needed them to be. Without that nurturing element from mom, in-house discipline and structure from dad, all Mark's early issues as a kid would just mutate, fester into something worse. A kid who wasn't receiving the proper love and attention at home was now turning to the streets looking for that same love and attention.
She wasn't the best mom far as taking care of her kids. Even if she saw this today or tomorrow, she would have to admit it because it speaks for itself. And I'm not gonna tell a lie for something that I know that's true, because I was a part of it. So I'm not gonna help you cover up your story, nor my dad.
He was living with another brother of his named Rodney, a child from his mother's previous marriage. He would be 10 years older and had a close relationship with Mark. This was also around the time his older brother Rodney had already left home for the army at 18 years old, which left his little brother Mark feeling more alone than ever.
After a while, when my sister couldn't keep them anymore, his mom put him in the Y. He enjoyed that. He enjoyed that because he got to be around other guys and stuff, shooting hoops, swimming. He was good doing that. And then once they moved from Highland Park to Southside, that's when they didn't go to the Y anymore. So now it's almost like his mom left him in the house to defend themselves then. You know, he was the oldest one between him and his sister.
Now, Mark getting into trouble will have a snowball effect, causing him to be suspended from school more than the average boy. So with his transition to George Wythe High, he's now 14 years old in the 9th grade, in which time the troublemaker inside him never wavered. He had this urge to align himself with the wrong crowd, constantly being arrested for things his brother Leon would consider stupid or avoidable. Overall, Mark was always a troubled kid, but you always knew he was good at heart. But as time flies, that same heart had turned to the game, and once he picked up the sticks, there was no turning back.
Richmond, the capital of Virginia, a proper noun in a geography book, but to its residents, Richmond is a state of mind, an adjective.
Tomorrow, everybody will be grabbing copies of Style Weekly. It's their annual edition, Your Very Richmond If. It's a tongue-in-cheek look at what Richmonders think of themselves and their city.
You're very Richmond if you like statues.
You are very Richmond if you feel pride in the Confederacy, love generally.
You're very Richmond if you miss Millen Rose.
You're very Richmond if you keep plenty of change in your car for the tolls.
Style Weekly began the contest in 1985 to gain readership.
These are some of the thousands of entries that didn't quite win. You are very Richmond if you know that the mosque isn't a Muslim place of worship. You are very Richmond if you think fashionable West End is one word. And here's my favorite. You know Richmond After 6 comes on at 7. I'm Marcia Brazda for Richmond After 6.
It's the year 1985, and 14-year-old Mark was a third of the way through his freshman year in high school before deciding to drop out. In a more normal household, an older brother such as Rodney would be expected to detour his baby brother from a life of crime. But after returning home from the army, it would be the total opposite, as he'd almost welcome Mark to the streets with open arms. So it was official, feeling like everything he would ever learn, need, or want could be obtained in the street. And with it being the mid-80s, which is considered peak season for crack rock in Richmond, he built a hefty rap sheet throughout the juvenile system, with it now becoming the norm to not see him for spurts at a time, spending no less than 1 or 2 years incarcerated during each bid.
He got put out of school a few times. By the time he got to the 9th grade, I don't even think he went back to school after that. By that time, he had became like a frequent flyer to the Juvenile Justice Department. Boom, that labeled him right then and there. They had their eyes on him. 14, 15 years old, they had their eyes stuck on him. Just unfortunately, he just wasn't able to turn it around.
But once Mark hit the legal age of 18, there were no more detention centers. He would now be sent to a place called Camp 13. Camp 13 was located at the Virginia State Penitentiary, which was situated at Belvedere and Spring Streets in Richmond, Virginia, just north of the James River.
It became one of those things like what Mark done did now. And it's so messed up, but it happens so often when families write somebody off because they can't quite get it together. Won't nobody keeping in touch anymore. And if his mom didn't say anything or my dad didn't say anything, they would try to pass it off. It's easy to cancel one out, especially in my dad's case when you already got multiple kids. It was to their fault, but when you're young, you just make a lot of mistakes. When I think about it, they was only in their 30s.
Now it's the year 1990, and Mark was convicted in the month of August for possession of cocaine, possession of marijuana, and possession of drug paraphernalia. But he received the imposition of sentence, which suspended the cocaine and marijuana convictions. And we'd have to give Mark half the credit for that outcome, because while doing his time at Camp 13 prison, he would write a letter to the judge saying he wanted to be better, promising to get out and become a productive member of society, claiming he wanted to teach others about crime, jail, and life itself. It isn't known if this swayed the judge in any way, but he was happy with the results nevertheless. But Mark, who was now free on his suspended sentences, wouldn't take long to pay the old judge a second visit. Just 4 months down the line, he was arrested on drug charges that December of 1990. And just as before, he pled guilty to possession of cocaine and possession of marijuana. Mark would follow his own footsteps by writing another letter to the judge, making the same empty promises, but the courts would realize that this was a rinse and repeat situation with Mark Sheppard. The judge ordered that he serve the sentences that were just suspended. He ultimately ended up doing 15 months of a 4-year prison bid.
We was always good, but because I had a 7-year advance over him, we tried to stay in touch. Then once he had started going to juvie and all this stuff just got wider and wider. But it was always a time I let him know I'm here for him. I didn't let any of his circumstances deter our brother relationship.
Now, upon Mark's release in December of '91, he get into a little masonry work with bricklaying being the bulk of his job description. But he didn't really have a job per se. It was more so a hustle. His father knew a guy who specialized in mercenary work and had them link up together, wanting him to make some sort of living while also staying out of trouble. So going into the new year of '92, he did a few odd jobs here and there and decided to push for something more permanent. And that's when he would land a job at a printing company called the Williamsburg Press.
And Mark had just got out. This is the time when he was at Williamsburg Press. He needed somewhere to stay. So because me and my ex splitting and I had this big house on the north side I needed help with. I say, Mark, I need a little help on such and such, got this big house. You cool with coming over here, helping me out or whatever? He said, oh yeah, bro, yeah, that worked out great. So we had everything planned for him to move in with me that next month. My dad undercutted me, went behind my back and offered him to come over there with him. Why Mark chose to do it, I'm not sure. It kind of was like a blessing in disguise.
By the month of July, he was officially discharged from parole, and it seemed as if Mark really kept his word about being a productive citizen. He was making all the right choices, all the necessary changes in his life, and if he were dabbling into any street activities on the side, he was very discreet about it. Now, as we fast forward into the year of '93, Mark had long since left his job at the Williamsburg Press. There's no real confirmation on why, but a wild guess says it was the hold that Richmond City streets had over him. Because around this same time period, he would come into contact with a New York native named Andre Graham, aka Panama. Andre, he would grow up in a rough neighborhood in the heart of Brooklyn, New York. He began selling drugs at the age of 14 due to his family having little to next to nothing. And like most inner city kids, he put in his application for a position in the streets. Now, he would later in life try his hand at getting a job, but never found an occupation he could hold on to long term. So after diving deeper into the street life, a string of crimes he committed in his hometown led him to Virginia in the year of '87 or late 1989. We don't know exactly when he got here, if he was on the run or just letting the heat die down.
He was a bad guy on the run from New York. If you weren't strong enough, he steered you wrong. And that was the whole thing. In that case, Mark was not a leader because he would have controlled the narrative. So he became more of a follower because he was looking to him to put money into his hands. As so-called, he was making him rich.
Upon his arrival, he lived off the 3400 block of Walmsley Boulevard, but he didn't waste time creating ties to the community by meeting a young woman named Chantra Mashura. Before long, he'd father a daughter with Chantra, naming her Courtney. But supposedly, after a brief time together, she'd break up with Andre, saying she asked him to choose between her and the family and being in the streets. And his actions would solidify his choice.
I don't know how he got here or if he had any family. He did have to have family here because my cousin kept his daughter. Somebody was here, and then he came to the South. And by Mark being in the South, I don't know how they must have crossed paths or whatever like that.
So later, this newfound partnership between him and Mark would eventually kick off a brutal chain of events that would more than anything test the meaning of real friendship. Mark's family noticed a sudden change in him. Every time they'd have a family function, he was nowhere to be found. No heads up, I'll see you later, or I'll catch you next times. He was a ghost to those he once shared laughs, loves, and hugs with. By now, all he knew and breathed was the streets, and he's essentially come to not care for his biological family anymore.
I didn't know of his friends or if he really had any friends, because Mark was not like a kid that had a whole bunch of friends. See this one, you see that one, you see him hanging with this one. It was never like that. He was kind of solo. Because of what he was doing, you would thought he had a bunch of friends, but basically he had associates. He never was partner in crime with nobody before Panama came along.
His brother Leon would later say, meeting Andre was the beginning of the end for Mark. He wasn't in the great lover state long before everything started to hit the fan, and it happened expeditiously. So quick that Mark himself couldn't enjoy the rise before their own downfall.
Once the crack epidemic started, you had a bunch of new players involved. Richmond was tripping. They was really tripping because we was getting up there at least 150 or more murders a year. But that's when you had all them guys out there just creating havoc. You had the Brown, the Flaxes, and the Johnsons and all of them. When they kicked it in, that's when it was like bang, 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 bang. Then the Newtown boys came into Richmond and created havoc. I lost a few friends due to them. It didn't calm down till they were all put away. Then we started bringing it back down into the low hundreds. There was too many players out there at one time that was just smoking. I mean, killing was like every day on the news, like Chicago.
Now we've all heard the stories from way back when, how them New York boys set up shop in Baltimore, invaded DC, and it wasn't long before they found their way further south to Richmond, Virginia. Places like Virginia Beach was a hot spot for a lot of dope boys along the East Coast, coming from the South and the North, mostly during the summer months.
No, I don't think nothing will jump up tonight. Everybody, all they want to do, as you can see, all you have to do is look. Everybody just want to have fun. They're just playing their music. Everybody's in the street dancing. What more can you ask for?
And when several of those guys came to the city of Richmond, there was this strong stigma attached to our culture, which considered us to be a little slower in the eyes of New Yorkers, not up to date or savvy enough to keep up with the North.
People always call Virginia slow. So when they want to do their dirt, people come to Virginia just like the Newtown gang did. We can come in and try to take that over. So nobody gave Virginia respect at all, especially the guys up north.
Having big name gangs feeling like they could do what they wanted, when they wanted, and whoever they wanted to. People like Christopher Goins, who massacred a family, or a crew called the Poison Clan, committing murders at such an alarming rate that caused street fractions from Richmond to come together for a brief moment in time. And if the guys from Richmond didn't kill them, they got ran out of town indefinitely. But of the very worst of them would be the Newtown boys. By the time they reached the end of their run, they began murdering their drivers, suppliers, workers, not wanting nobody alive that they dealt with in any capacity. And like those guys, Andre was no different. So because of their downfall, plus the fall of the Johnson, Brown, and Flax families, it would give Mark and Panama the room they needed to do what they had planned. And like any young dude coming up in the hood back then, they wanted to get rich and quick, mainly dealing in distribution of crack cocaine. It's said that Mark would end up locking down Jefferson Village, while Andre had a stronghold on Midlothian Village. The two-man army, along with a few soldiers, had this part of town sold up for the time being. And it was the absence of those dangerous families who ran the mid to late 80s that would open the door for all of it. A new takeover was nearly here, and Mark and Andre would barely break 8 to 10 months. Because after the year 1992 came to a close, they stepped into a deadly year of 93 with a totally different game plan. The fast life that Mark and Andre lived flew by, weeks feeling like days, hours were minutes, never really taking the time to actually enjoy the fruits of their labor. But then there were the hard 9-to-5ers, the mothers and fathers working overtime just to break even at the end of the month, the young college students with 2 part-time jobs to pay for tuition, or those lost souls roaming the streets just living, day for day. Time for them was real. Every second, hour, and minute was accounted for. And the same could be said for a 20-year-old woman named Sheryl Stack, who ensured that her time here on Earth would be spent in happiness and health. Now I introduce you to this woman because months after moving over an hour away from her hometown, she crossed the brutal path of the New York native that we now know as Andre. Now Sheryl Stack was from South Hill, a small town inside Mecklenburg County, Virginia, having a population with less than 5,000 people living in the area. She was known back home as a golden child, a genuine and giving person. She's the type of person who volunteered to teach music to underprivileged kids coming from troubled backgrounds. She was also a classical musician, mastering several musical instruments such as the piano and the clarinet. she decided to relocate to Richmond in early August of 1993, having plans on attending school at VCU as a junior student, working toward a master's degree in primary education. So as she settled into her new city environment, moving into the Stratford Hills apartments off of Forest Hill Avenue, she would then get a job at a place called Steak and Ale, a restaurant located off Midlothian Turnpike. Back in the early 90s, most folks would only eat here on special occasions, being that the food was overly priced, which was surprising to some, considering how bad the area was at the time. But not so much as today, because this section of Midlothian is presently riddled with crime, drug use, and its own tent city for the homeless tucked away inside of wooded areas. So it's possible that there were little warning signs noticed by the small town girl from South Hill. Either way, Sheryl was living the hard worker's lifestyle as intended. She adjusted, poured her own weight, making the next day count, just as she did the last. A few weeks later, we step into the month of September, and while Sheryl Stack was off living her best life, Andre was out with his new girlfriend, Priscilla Booker. She would end up witnessing a transaction between Andre and a man known as Poochie, a transaction that involved a brown paper bag with a .45 caliber pistol inside, allegedly to settle a $500 drug debt that Poochie owed to Andre. And ever since that day, Andre kept that .45 cuffed in his possession, as it never left his side. He'd even sleep with the gun close by. Most would think this was solely for protection, especially now that he and Mark were controlling several areas, but Andre, he would have other plans on how he was going to use his new buddy. Now I think we can all agree that compared to Sheryl Stack's upbringing, it's as if Andre and Mark came from a totally different universe, opposite mentalities, morals, and cultural differences. And the only thing all these individuals would have in common was the ambition to be somebody in life, with all having their own idea of who that actually was. But of course, the avenue they'd take to get there were two parallel roads between life and death. On a cold Wednesday night of October 6, 1993, a man from out of town named Dennis Miller, a businessman, he'd check into the La Quinta Inn motel off of Midlothian Turnpike, which was across the street from the Steak and Ale restaurant where Sheryl worked. Later in the night around 7 p.m., there were several gunshots coming from the first floor of the motel, and no one really knew where it was coming from, but police were immediately called afterward. Upon finding which room the shots originated from, they'd find Dennis inside with a gunshot wound to the neck, and could only give the description of two unknown black men in their early 20s, while never actually seeing their faces. He'd say one of the men spoke with a Jamaican accent, but they were more than sure that the accent was bogus. Through further inspection inside, they see the side table was turned over and found an open empty suitcase lying on the bed. All in all, he was robbed for a few dollars in cash, a Citibank Master Gold card, and an Amoco gasoline card. But not long after, he would pass away, succumbing to his wounds.
It was horrific. It's like, who would do this? And that was the part that got me in the end, because I'm looking at these, it's like, here's a man out of town from Florida. I think he was a salesman, the guy that was at La Quinta Inn. He just came in, got a hotel room. He was killed there at the hotel.
As of now, there were no witnesses, suspects, or other victims, but it was later in the year confirmed that Andre Graham was definitely one of the men. The same night of the robbery, the Citibank card was used, and the next day, both cars were used at the Virginia Center Commons Mall in Henrico County, with the few individuals giving matching descriptions of the suspects in the motel robbery. Now, detectives wouldn't catch on to the credit card charges for another day or so, and they'd ask the public if they remembered the guys using the cars. They wanted to hear from them ASAP. But in less than 36 hours after Dennis Miller's attack, another one would take place just a few yards away from the La Quinta Inn motel, but this one was brutal, and it might have garnered them a solid lead this time around. Now, we don't know if Sheryl worked that night or if she even knew about it, but if she did, it definitely wouldn't bother her much, as she would show up for work the following day. Now, after acquiring the job at this restaurant, Sheryl would meet a guy named Edward Martin, and by this point, they've only been dating for 2 weeks, but were very fond of one another, being in a full-on relationship. The next day rolls around, it's October 7th. Sheryl and Edward will be hard at work as usual. So as the day winds down to about 8:45 p.m., Edward clocks out and waited around for Sheryl, who worked until close that night. By 10 p.m., the young couple made way out the door together, having plans to grab an early breakfast at a different restaurant downtown. While both owned their own wheels, they'd leave together in Edward's car. It was a burgundy Nissan, a 240 SX sports vehicle. It would be a few hours before they returned to the restaurant around 3 a.m. As they pulled into the parking lot, a night auditor by the name of James Jones was standing outside the motel across the street, talking with another employee. As the couple stood beside Cheryl's blue Volvo, they had a brief conversation before eventually kissing one another. At some point, they decided to sit inside Cheryl's car. Andre Graham, along with another guy thought to be Mark Sheppard, approached the vehicle, gun in hand as the couple stayed seated inside. They then commanded them to get out the car, and after Sheryl and Edward exited the vehicle, Andre directed Edward to hand over his wallet and car keys to Mark, who was unarmed. Even though throughout this case, he was never named as the person being present along with Andre, it was a very high chance he was the one there, as you couldn't get Andre without Mark, and you couldn't get Mark without Andre. Andre kept his pistol aimed in their direction while Mark searched Cheryl's car. He started it up, got out, and did the same for Edward's vehicle. He spotted a box of CDs that Edward owned, moving them to the back seat after. As he continued searching Edward's car, Andre would say to them both, "If y'all lie down on the ground and close your eyes, I won't hurt y'all." Both did as they were told, but even after complying with him, he let off one shot into Cheryl's head. Seconds later, Andre's face would be the last thing Edward saw before he placed his .45 caliber revolver on the left side of his cheek, being shot in the head as well. Now Edward was surprisingly conscious after being shot, and he realized that his car was being started, now coming straight toward him. So he quickly rolled over to get out of the way, allegedly with Mark behind the wheel, missing him by literal inches. Now about 20 to 25 minutes had gone by since James seen the couple pulling up to the restaurant, and while manning the front desk, he heard what he later described as two loud noises. Upon checking outside, he had witnessed the moment Edward was almost ran over with his own car, watching the burgundy Nissan speed away from the Steak and Nail parking lot. After Sheryl and Edward were shot, they laid there, holding hands, with Edward trying his best to communicate with her. James then made way across the street, and as he got close to the Cheryl's Volvo, he noticed her body laying beside Edward's, still fighting to speak to his girlfriend. James immediately called the police, who just so happened to have a squad car a block away. RPD was taking precautions after yesterday's murder. It just wasn't enough to prevent tonight's events. The officer was at the scene within a minute or so. Both Sheryl and Edward were still alive. An ambulance would soon rush them both to MCV. Sheryl, she was strictly comatose when she arrived at the hospital, but after 2 days, she never regained consciousness, passing away from her head wound. Edward surprisingly survived the entire ordeal, but his gunshot wound to the head caused extensive brain injuries. During his surgery, doctors would have to remove his left eye from the socket, leaving it empty until a plastic cap was replaced. Edward's brain also began to swell, so after a grueling 7 hours of surgery, they ultimately saved Edward's life. Now during his recovery, Edward had to wear a purple bicycle helmet for 2 months to protect the opening to his skull. He also had a partial paralysis on the right side of his body, and to top it off, he'd never speak or communicate the same again. Edward's comprehension, memory, and intelligence were perfectly normal, but now it just takes more effort and time to actually express what he's thinking. So when the time does come, and it will, Edward will be 100% clear to testify against the man responsible for his trauma and taking his girlfriend's life. Hours later, after Cheryl's murder, Andre drove around in Edward's burgundy Nissan sports car, and he'd eventually go to Midlothian Village, where he shared an apartment with his girlfriend Priscilla, not knowing he was making a grave mistake by letting Priscilla see him inside that car. At some point, Andre removed Edward's CD collection, transferring them into his girlfriend's vehicle without her knowledge. They hadn't lived together long, with Andre moving in just 4 months ago in July, so her loyalty to him wouldn't be as strong as he thought. Later that same morning, Priscilla was watching the news on their analog box television, where reports of Andre's deeds were on full display, prompting Priscilla to mention to him in a casual manner of, "Hey, look what happened up the street," sort of thing. But Andre's reaction was a little cold, his response being, "Why you worried about other people?" He then asked Priscilla to stop watching the news, but she continued to do so, which made him upset, and Priscilla was totally oblivious to what he did, because they hadn't mentioned the stolen red sports car in the specific report. She asked Andre, "Why shouldn't I watch the news?" Andre's response, "I know who did it, but I didn't do it." 2 to 3 days after Cheryl's murder, Priscilla would find Edward's box of over 200 CDs in the trunk of her own car. After questioning Andre about it, he'd come up with some pie-in-the-sky excuse, telling her he had bought an entire box of CDs for just $10. So afterward, Priscilla put the box inside of a storage unit which was rented in her mother's name. Now whether she were directed by Andre to do this or she herself thought this up is a mystery, but it was later seen as a bit strange, with that being her first course of action. Now at some point during that same day, Andre would dump the car off the 1700 block of Clarkston Road, not knowing he had already had it for too long. The police recovered Edward's car, but they were unable to obtain any useful fingerprint evidence from it. There was a $6,000 reward being offered for information in the killing. The Steak and Ale restaurant will put up $2,500. Edward Martin's family put up $2,500 as well, while the Crime Stoppers organization pulled some weight by posting $1,000 of their own. At least 300 people showed up to pay their last respects to the young woman who was described as the brightest of lights, with a fourth of the people attending the funeral being children that she tutored. One of them would say to Cheryl's mother, and I quote, "Without Cheryl's help, I wouldn't have gotten through social studies." On the day of November 22nd, it's said that Mark allegedly tried robbing a friend of his and Andre's named Benji Vaughn, and during the deed, he accidentally shot Benji in his foot with a .38 caliber handgun. We say accidentally because the account would later be told verbatim at a trial for Mark Sheppard, with Benji screaming from the stand saying, and I quote, "Mark was my friend and I felt like it was an accident," visibly emotional about the situation, which makes you wonder if it were really a robbery gone bad or just a friend shooting another by mistake. But Benji had told police who questioned him at the hospital that same day that he was definitely robbed. Either way, the trial that Benji Vaughn would testify in was for a totally different crime, a crime that Mark and Andre both committed just a day after shooting Benji. Now after Andre and Mark's robbery of Dennis Miller, the robbery/murder of Sheryl and Edward, one would come up with several theories about these two. Because if these guys were making such a huge amount of money in Jefferson Village and Midlothian Village, there shouldn't be a need to rob folks at all.
They classified them as low-level kingpins because of the totality of all of the things that will consider and make you a drug kingpin. They couldn't have been but so much of kingpins because they didn't live no kingpin lifestyle. And neither one of them had no house of their own that was a flashy house. They didn't even have vehicles. Because of the killings, they try to make the killings look like only kingpins or lords would do this type of stuff. But no, it was further from the truth.
It could be that the rumors of them having strongholds in these two neighborhoods were untrue. Maybe they were in the middle of a drought, causing it to be little to no drugs floating around that was needed to sell. Or the worst of them all, what if it didn't matter how they made their money and that they were willing to hurt or kill anyone who got in between the money and them? On the sunnier side of town, there was a married white couple living in Chesterfield's Solar One subdivision off the 700 block of Scottenham Terrace, the Rosenbluths. 40-year-old Richard and 35-year-old Rebecca, described as a quiet middle-class couple who'd eventually cross paths with Andre, later on introducing them to Mark. Now Richard, he was one of those typical white men who had a childhood that Mark and Andre could only dream of, raised in a two-parent home while growing up in Northern Virginia. He was pegged as a very bright child. In later years, he'd go on to start college at East Carolina University, then attend the Berklee College of Music in Boston, becoming a musician and a percussionist. Sometime after, he'd meet Rebecca while playing with the band in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. He'd then try his hand at making a living through music, but finally decided that it was time to do something different. He went into the coffee service business and started out sweeping floors in a warehouse for a company called the Coffee Butler, and eventually winding up in Richmond as the company's regional manager. Now back in '87, Richard and Rebecca tied the knot, being happily married from then on, which was a total opposite of Mark, who was a 16-year-old incarcerated in juvie, and a 17-year-old Andre, who was running wild through the streets of New York. The Rosenbluths were officially starting their journey to success together, and from an outside point of view, they were living the dream, having everything they wanted, except a child of their own. Now I bet you're wondering, like most of us, how does the lives of this quiet married couple run parallel with the lives of Mark and Andre? Well, it was due to the introduction of something huge, something that destroyed whole communities, families, relationships, ethics, and moral obligations. Something that we've talked about on this channel countless of times. And that, my friend, was crack cocaine. A race of people who would normally steer clear of this neighborhood stuck around it like it was their birthplace.
And we're not going to be treated like the Native Americans and Africans. We're not going to walk around in the Trail of Tears.
Having babies that would in turn grow up here and also have families of their own here. So it's sad to think that crack brought a lot of our elder members together under a common goal, but not without ruining some lives along the way. By the fall season of 1992 came around, the Rosenbluths got into using cocaine, an addiction that grew stronger by the day would soon have a visible effect on the couple. Now Andre, he would begin selling drugs to Richard after seeing him around Midlothian Village, Jefferson Village, and Hillside a few times.
He was on one of his coffee butler routes, riding around Commerce Road or something. If I can catch me a quick one, you know, somebody's always hanging out. So I think that's what he was doing. And somehow Panama saw him. Get off these streets back here, man, because they're going to get you or whatever.
He noticed other drug dealers around these areas robbing him. Back in those days, a white man lingering around the hood meant one or two things. He either got money or he's coming to spend money. Most were seen as a walking lick. So Andre, seizing the opportunity, told Richard that instead of taking a chance on coming out here and getting robbed, he could just page him when he needed a fix. And from then on out, Andre would sell cocaine to Richard on a regular basis, one of his best customers. Both Richard and Rebecca eventually upgraded to freebasing, which was cheaper, more addictive, but didn't last too long.
Everybody knew that that was a cheap high for a low amount of money. Because back then, the guys that were weed dealers, they flipped to crack because it was more money. You know, you stood a better profit.
Causing them to chase the feeling like anyone else who had been already hooked. For 6 straight months, the Rosenbluths were so addicted to cocaine that they were copping every single day, with Andre and Mark being just 2 out of the dozen more people who sold it to them. They started coming up short more and more as time went on. Instances where they'd usually pay what they owed on top of buying more drugs turned into them only able to break even, leading to them copping from other dealers to avoid paying the debt. Because if they did so, they wouldn't be able to get high, all while not knowing where to get another dollar until payday. They'd get advances from work and use all of the money to feed their addictions. But in order for them to work, they'd have to feel well, without the hot and cold sweats, without the painful withdrawal. But now, making less money created a domino effect, with it all crashing down piece by piece.
America's public enemy #1 is drug abuse.
When they run out of cash, they started bartering with them by using their own credit cards to buy hotel rooms, clothes, and things like food for their suppliers. But this wore itself thin as they became largely indebted, digging themselves a hole so deep it would take 3 to 4 paychecks to dig themselves out. They've been constantly threatening them to come up with the money for some time now, so they decided to pay them a little visit a few days after Thanksgiving. On Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, Richard's father, Stanley Rosenbluth, saw him while at another son's home in Fairfax Station. Stanley would say that there was no way to describe the drastic change in his son, and Richard, electing to hide his addiction, responded with the excuse of having the flu. He knew Richard also had been taking medication for hepatitis C, so his father urged him to see a doctor when he returned home, being totally unaware of Richard's cocaine use. Now 3 days later, it's a Saturday on November 27, 1993. Richard would take Andre to the Cloverleaf Mall off of Midlothian Turnpike, a mall that today is closed down, replaced by a Kroger supermarket. The goal was for Andre to purchase a pair of leather boots and a hat, which would be exchanged for cocaine. It said he spent the bulk of that Saturday with the female friend named Dawn Thornton. After leaving Dawn's apartment that evening, he visited a place called G's Restaurant Lounge, and then after, he gave his girlfriend Priscilla a call, telling her he was going to the Images nightclub that night, and she actually went looking for Andre, possibly with the intuition of him cheating, and she remained there until the night spot closed, which was past midnight. But not once did she see him at all. After having a very active day, he rented a motel room near the Waffle House on Midlothian Turnpike around 2 to 3 a.m. And alongside him was a different woman by the name of Rachel Walters. The next time Priscilla hears from Andre was from a car phone between 4 and 5 a.m. telling her that he and Mark had bought a new car. And shortly after the call, Andre appeared at her apartment in a black Honda Accord. But it was those hours in between renting the motel and making that call that couldn't be accounted for. Because while we don't know where Mark is located at this time, we do know that both of these men would end up at the home of the Rosenbluths that early Sunday morning. November 28th, 1993, after Andre rented his room with another one of his many female friends, him, Mark, their friend Benji, went out to pay the Rosenbluths a visit. They would all arrive in Benji's car in the suburban subdivision inside Chesterfield. It was a quiet night on the 700 block of Scottenham Terrace when all three men left the vehicle to knock on the door. The Rosenbluths would let them inside with no resistance as they were in constant dealings with these two, but I had imagined that they had no choice in the matter. If you yourself were entering this home, you'd be able to spot several pipes lying around, some with crack residue still inside. The house's condition would paint the picture of a couple in a full-on addiction, and these men were here to take advantage of that very fact. They would all go into the kitchen area to talk, with the Rosenbluths allegedly pleading their case on the large sum of money they owed. They started cursing, bickering back and forth, with them now inside the den of the house, at which time Andre would start going on about the money Richard owed and not having it all. Richard had only $100 to his name, and he was hoping to still spend it all on crack, and this made them angry enough to up their weapons. Richard and Rebecca lay bleeding out on the floor, Richard being shot twice in the face with a bullet to his nose and a bullet in one of his eyes, while Rebecca had been shot 4 times with 2 bullets to the head, 1 to the shoulder and 1 to the neck, all from close range. Benji, who never pulled the trigger, stood nearby, but he then suggested that they should loot the house. With all in agreement, Mark spotted a stereo in the corner of the den, and after picking it up, he stepped over Rebecca's body as if it were a simple spill he wanted to avoid. They ransacked the home for jewelry, electronics, and miscellaneous items, leaving the house trashed and in complete disarray. Nearing the end of their mission, they did their best to wipe anything they may have touched, having the thought process of not leaving anything in this house. Investigators would later say that the countertops and wine glasses were wiped clean, all while still finding a razor blade over a magazine with coke residue around it, which belonged to Rebecca. So there was proof of some effort, but it wasn't enough. They just didn't know it yet. So now about to make their getaway, they grabbed the couple's keys to their cars. Benji would pull off in his own vehicle that they arrived in, while Mark escaped in Richard's 1988 black Nissan Pathfinder. But Andre, he'd get behind the wheel of Rebecca's black 1988 Honda Accord. It's later that same morning, hours after the murders of Richard and Rebecca, and out of everything these two could have done, they did the last thing you should do while in possession of evidence from a recent double murder, with them having no qualms about riding around the city of Richmond in the Rosenbluths cars. As we know, Andre lives with his girlfriend Priscilla Booker in Midlothian Village, while Mark lives with his father Kenneth in a middle-class neighborhood off of 9300 Carway Court. Now Mark, along with some of the items he stole, will park Richard's truck directly in the driveway of his father's house. He then removed the license plates, taking everything in the house afterward. It was also unbeknownst to Mark that there was an Henrico officer living directly across the street.
Policeman, not a sheriff, but he was a Henrico cop with the cop car in the driveway and everything.
And while this was unlucky for him, that specific officer wouldn't have a hand in the events to come. Events that Mark and Andre all but created the catalyst for.
See, what was so funny, you the cop, but he never looked over across the street and saw the Rosenbluth Pathfinder in my daddy's driveway. It was right there. It was right in front of him the whole time.
Even the DA in Andre's later trial would call their next set of moves dumb, for a pair of guys who's supposed to be street smart. We can't be sure what he was planning to do with all the items, but he knew exactly what he would do with the vehicle. And as if their criminal minds thought alike, Andre would essentially do the same as his partner. We previously learned of Priscilla's suspicions of him cheating, which led to her looking for him at the club Images. So that following morning when she got the call about them buying a new car, that car was actually Rebecca's Honda Accord. Another day passes by. It's now November 29th, 1993. The cops hadn't found the bodies yet, so they'd attempt to take advantage of this massive head start. First, Mark stopped by a shop formerly known as German Auto Sales on Hall Street, owned by a man named Joe Jafarbe, and Mark intended on selling Richard's Pathfinder, offering to sell it to Joe for $2,700. And right then, Joe would say he knew something was wrong, saying, and I quote, "You cannot buy that type of car that cheap. How can you sell a Pathfinder for $2,700? You can't buy no truck for $2,700. Now Andre, behind the wheel of the Honda Accord, pulled onto the property shortly after, and after accepting Joe wouldn't budge on the sale, he then requested an estimate on a paint job for the vehicle, which heightened his suspicions even more. And Joe would tell Mark verbatim, "You don't need to paint that truck. That truck has a good paint job." Joe was suspicious of Mark from the gate, likely stalling him on purpose. Joe then allowed Mark to wash the truck on his property, and shortly afterward, he drove off behind Andre. Their next step was to Henrico County off the 2200 block of Lombardi Road, headed to the Gortney Body Shop. And it was the same game this time around. Mark asked for an estimate on the paint job, requesting it to be a dark gray color to match the interior. The owner got the same vibe as the last and denied service. After striking out twice, they would cut their losses by dumping the vehicles in different places. Dumping the Honda Accord off of Withmar Avenue behind Midlothian Village on the south side of Richmond, and then they would dump the Pathfinder inside Suburban Apartment Complex, which was near Libby Avenue and West Broad Street. But Andre figured he still had a chance to turn over a few dollars by pawning Rebecca's engagement ring. He drove to Martin Coin, a scrap jewelry and coin shop in Richmond. He offered up a 30-point diamond ring and got $67.67 for it. And investigators were actually floored when they found out that Andre cooperated with the pawning process, a process required by federal law that you produce a driver's license and a Polaroid snapshot. But not only that, Andre repeated the same process when he returned the next day and sold the shop more of the couple's jewelry for $106.51, coming out to $174.18 total. So looking at inflation, Andre would have a little over $300 worth of spending power back then compared to today. But unbeknownst to Andre and Mark, today was the day that the Rosenbluth's bodies would be found. Richard's mother and father would make repeated attempts to contact their son that weekend to check on him. When they couldn't reach them Sunday or Monday, they began to worry. His father Stanley called both their employers on Monday and learned that neither of them reported to work. And on November 30th, Tuesday morning, Stanley made a second call to Rebecca's boss, Cullen Walker. After getting a hold of him, Cullen would offer to call the police and accompany them to the couple's home, knowing that this was out of the norm for them both. When they arrived, police found Richard and Rebecca lying dead inside their den. The gruesome scene of their fatal head wounds set the neighborhood on edge when they'd eventually hear about the horrible details.
That was huge because, of course, who was all involved. I think it was like Thanksgiving time or something, and it came on the news and stuff. Richard and Rebecca Rosenbluth killed, execution style type stuff, and the vehicles was missing and all that. I was like, damn, who did this?
Later in the day, around 1 p.m. that afternoon, Stanley's doorbell rang. It was the Arlington County Police, coming in person to tell him and his wife what happened to their son and daughter-in-law, just 2 days before they made that call. So like any loving parents, they rushed to Chesterfield, Virginia to talk with the local authorities. After talking with the Rosenbluth's parents, they were able to determine that their jewelry and cars had been stolen. And after 2 days, they would find Rebecca's Honda where Andre left it, on Withmar Avenue, a side street leading to a wooded area behind Midlothian Village. At the same time, police discovered Richard's Pathfinder parked inside the apartment complex. But these Henrico officers had no idea that this vehicle was connected to a double murder in Chesterfield. Thinking this was just another stolen car, they keep surveillance on the truck in case the perps show back up. They say in most cases like this, after stealing the car, the suspect will drop it off and pick it up later. So while Henrico cops sat on Richard's truck, their patience would eventually pay off. The city got wind of the Rosenbluth's murder scene, and every single news station broadcasted the story. It most likely panicked Andre and Mark, and they'd make a grave mistake. A mistake that gave the Henrico cops the break they were searching for, because just 2 days later, as expected, the perps would show back up to the scene of Richard's stolen Pathfinder.
Then it was like a manhunt, and every time you turn around, it's like, they still haven't found the people. So I think a week almost had passed.
On December 2nd, 1993, it's around 10 p.m. this night when they spot Andre pulling up with Mark riding shotgun. Mark quickly jumps out the car, making way toward Richard's truck with 2 canisters in hand, intending on setting the car on fire to get rid of any trace evidence.
When they went to get the jug of gas, they was on the chase, and that's when they was going into Henrico. Panama was still there with Mark while he was lighting it on fire.
And doesn't notice one of the officers approaching the vehicle with him still inside. When Mark does notice him, he hops out and fled on foot down the street, but the foot chase was brief as he was caught shortly after.
When he saw Mark getting towed off, he jetted.
Andre was also arrested after police stopped the vehicle he was in just a few blocks from the apartment.
The police was already on it. They was waiting to see. It's like, I know they ain't gonna be that dumb to sit here and come back to the vehicle. They should have just left it alone. Now the car been sitting. By the car sitting, it had a chance for the police to look for it. And they say, let's see if he come back to the scene of the crime. And he did.
At the most, they were only looking at grand larceny and resisting arrest. But Chesterfield detectives picked up on a connection and would identify Andre as a suspect in a previous crime. And it wouldn't be the only one, because between the robberies of the Rosenbluths, Sheryl Stack, and Edward Martin, Andre would fit the description for all three. Authorities believed that Mark was the second man at Sheryl's murder scene, but Edward couldn't identify him.
That wasn't even Mark's connection. The Rosenbluth was Panama's connection. Because they was together, that's just how it went, but those was not Mark's people, that was his people.
They also believed the two men were involved in a robbery and shooting a month earlier of Dennis Miller at the La Quinta Inn. But again, the victim couldn't identify the robbers. So at this moment, they knew these two were a lock for the Rosenbluths murder, but as for the other crimes, you'd think the detectives would have to earn their paychecks. But because of Mark and Andre's sloppy decisions after the crimes, it wouldn't be hard to convict. The last nail in both their face would arrive just days after the arrest, when they both called back home to their loved ones and incriminate themselves. On the morning of December 3rd, Andre, who was incarcerated in the Chesterfield County Jail, made a telephone call to his girlfriend, Priscilla. And he did this in the presence of a Chesterfield County deputy sheriff. Andre told Priscilla several times during the conversation to go into the closet, get the bag with the shit in it, and get rid of it. The deputy sheriff would say he was very persistent in her getting that bag, so he immediately reported the conversation to his superiors. And shortly thereafter, a detective from the Chesterfield County Police Department went to Priscilla's apartment. There he found a .45 caliber pistol in a plastic bag with a towel on top, along with the .45 ammunition on the table nearby. But the gun was heavily oiled, and the police were unable to recover any fingerprints from it. Priscilla's apartment was then ripped apart, finding several items linked to the crimes, and Priscilla herself wouldn't feel the need to stay loyal to Andre anymore. And it didn't help that allegedly one of the detectives would outright threaten her by saying, and I quote, "If you don't testify against Andre, then we're going to charge you with murder and take your kids away." 2 days after, on December 5th, Mark would essentially make a similar call to his loved ones.
They didn't think when it happened what to do right then and there. They were more so in shock, and now we caught. Oh, let me call Shorty's. Oh yeah, I'm gonna call my dad too.
He attempted to call his father, asking if he could get rid of the gun, but if he was planning to do so, he wouldn't be able to get rid of it in time. Their father had been on the way to church when officers showed up with the search warrant.
And I guess my daddy was going to do it after he came back from church. And they caught him outside getting ready to get in the car. So if they would have waited 10, 15 minutes longer, he would have been gone.
Saying that his father had no choice to let him in, being that he was a convicted felon himself. They found the suitcase with the Rosenbluth's names, address, and telephone number on it, finding the stereo equipment and license plates of their black Nissan, also finding the very weapon that was used in the murders. Officers would ask his father if he had ever seen it before, and Kenneth agreed that he did. And just the same as Andre's reaction, they were floored, wondering why they would even keep the items afterward. The autopsies of Richard and Becky revealed traces of cocaine inside their bodies, and their family members thought there was no reason for the drug use at all, saying that they were really starting to make it in life, seeing them as the typical American couple. But even with all the facts, they still found it hard to believe, and while they didn't dispute it, they felt that finding a reason for why the drug use started was too stressful to think about. So now with their killers' faces plastered everywhere on the news, the parents along with the public were immediately calling for the death penalty.
I was getting ready for work, sitting on the bed, put my shoes on or something. The 12 o'clock news came on. Boom, my brother's picture comes up on the TV. We finally caught the people that was involved in the Rosenbluth murder, Mark Sheppard and Andre Graham, and I'm like, I'd never forget that moment. I couldn't even go to work. How? Why? What? You so used to other people you see on TV, stuff happening or whatever, but for my brother's mugshot to come on the TV like that, and then the phones just started ringing. Phone just started ringing. Did you see that? Did you see that? That was Mark all the time. That was Mark. It was unbelievable, just unbelievable. Nothing to that extent I would have ever saw coming. Nothing. For me to see that in that capacity of a high-profile crime as that was a big high-profile crime. Big.
Mark's older brother Leon felt compelled to change his name tag while at work, all because of the negative news surrounding his brother Mark. He worked at a toll road at the time, which was formerly known as the Nickel Bridge. There were several individuals who came through the toll that noticed that tainted name, Sheppard. But the first person to make mention of it was an up-and-coming reporter by the name of Gwen Williams. Seemingly desperate for any info involving the case, she would make a distasteful remark regarding his brother, saying, and I quote, "Are you the good shepherd or the bad shepherd?" With his brother now behind bars, the young reporter already knew the answer to her own question.
It was a journalist on Channel 8. Gwen Williams was the one that came and harassed me on the toll road and asked me that question. Okay, I always want my name to be known, but not in this way at all. Because now that name is damaged. So they switched me from Powhite Parkway to the Boulevard Bridge where it was not really a lot of traffic,
causing Leon to feel even worse. He tried to report Gwen for her unprofessionalism, but the claim was taken lightly. Mark and Andre would wreak so much havoc that name itself would be tarnished for years to come. A year goes by, and it was time for Andre's trial. And who we know today is Fighting Joe Morrissey would take on Andre's case pro bono. This was just 1 year after playing for the other side as the Commonwealth's attorney, while Mark's trial won't happen until July, where he'll ultimately be tried on similar charges. During Andre's trial, he pulled every card in the deck. As the facts played out for the jury to hear, it almost seemed pointless for him to fight the case. So while in a desperate position, Andre would be the first to turn on any and everyone he could just to see a slither of light at the end of his long tunnel.
Joe Morrissey felt that we coming out the gate first and we're gonna throw all the blame on this guy.
He'd first attempt to place blame on the guy we know earlier in the story as Poochie, saying that on November 30th, which was 1 day after the Rosenbluth's murder, is when Poochie would give him the brown paper bag with the gun inside that killed the couple, along with the car keys to Rebecca's Honda. But his now ex-girlfriend Priscilla debunked his entire statement by telling the jury he got the gun in September. So not only would he snitch, but he also lied on a homie to save his own skin. Andre would also accuse Mark of being the sole killer in Sheryl Stack's murder, even though Andre was the only one identified by one of the victims who survived, which was Edward Martin, who took the stand to point out his attacker. He then admitted to selling drugs to the Rosenbluths and being present at the scene of their murders, but he didn't kill him, as he would say, laying all the dirty work toward Mark, which would all but open the door for Mark to do the same. Throughout their investigation into the pair known as Rock and Panama, they were convinced that both men had murdered and maimed at least 10 other people in the short time they ran together, but without any evidence to prove it.
So once we found out where he was, we went over there. They gave me the phone to holler at him for a second. When I asked him, I'm like, yo, what's up, bro? I say, who was this character you was with? Yeah, man, such. I say, but why? Why was you with him? Oh, man, we doing things, man. You know, he was making me rich. And I just shook my head and I was like, hey, bro, you was on that type of time? And I say, you know, I ain't gonna hold you too long because your mom won't speak back to you. But I'm gonna be at your trial. I'm gonna be there every single day, in which I was, from jury selection until sentencing. I was there every day. He said, yeah, bro, I appreciate that. I said, man, I got you. I said, I got you. I said, big bro, got you.
Mark would end up testifying at his own trial that a third person, being Benji Vaughn, was the second trigger man and not himself, admitting that he did accidentally shoot Benji in the foot while he was fooling around with the .38, a gun that he claimed belonged to Benji himself. Police kept the bullet from that earlier shooting and were able to match it up with the .38 caliber bullets taken from the bodies of the two Rosenbluths. So after, Benji would elect to save himself by telling police that the gun actually belonged to Mark. Mark was more than angry, claiming he was framed by prosecutors who knew that another man committed the murders. While confined to Greensville Correctional Center, he'd say, and I quote, I'm mad because what's going on. I'm a peaceful guy, and I'm trying to stay strong for my family. I'm a family person. Basically, I'm here because I'm not a snitch. When Benji implicated me, that was the most ultimate betrayal anyone could feel. The code was broken then, so I felt free to testify against him. I hate the fact that the Rosenbluth family feels the way they do about me, but that's not their fault. but by the time he tried to implicate anyone else, no one believed him. The same went for Andre.
Every story has a beginning. They're gonna lay out the whole map of when you started going wrong because you've been in the system so long. So they're gonna present all of that for evidence to make this person look worse than what they are. There was never a time in court where they even talked about what things went wrong for him, his education, parental guidance and all of that. They only want to discuss the bad stuff because that's the prosecutor's job. All of those murders that they were all accused of part of, I saw it all because I always read the paper every day. A lot of that stuff I didn't find out until his trial. And that's when I realized that was another reason why I wanted to be there too, because let me find out what my brother has been doing in these years. I might not like what I'm going to hear, but at least I'm gonna have the information to understand how we got here. When I was saying all these cases and all and this, I was like, wow. It's like hitting left and right. I never thought that he pulled the trigger. He might have been present, helped do some other things, but I never, ever saw him actually killing anybody. I never did. Until this day, I still don't.
The state's attorney would make it very clear that the evidence in this case unequivocally proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mark Sheppard was guilty. So in closing arguments, they say this: what Andre and Mark did was despicable. It's disgusting to distribute drugs, but we're not here to show that they were drug dealers. The Rosenbluths paid out everything they had, and at the end of that road, they didn't have anything else to get except their lives and the property they had around their home. After almost 8 hours of deliberation, a jury convicted Andre Graham of 2 counts of capital murder and was also found guilty of 2 counts of robbery. The jury recommended a 23-year sentence for all but the 2 capital murder convictions. Mark's fate was relatively the same, with him being sentenced to death in the murders of the couple. But later, it was seen that Andre got off scot-free, and he was also sentenced to death for his part in the murders. He claimed Mark's last words to him were, "No matter what I do, I'm not going to let you go down on this." But later on in their death row bid, Andre would say he never came forth and did anything for him since day one. After their trials, both would be transferred to death row. Through the 5 years of awaiting their fates, Panama and Rock were no longer the clique-type 2-man army like before. While at Mecklenburg Correctional Center, Mark immediately put out the word that Andre was a snitch, a claim Andre knew was the truth but tried his damnedest to dispute. But it came a time where how much involvement Andre had in the killings came into question. Now at the Greensville Correctional Center, it's said that an inmate overheard the person everyone called Rock talking to another inmate about Panama, saying verbatim, "You know Panama shouldn't even be here. Panama didn't even pull the trigger. He was just there," speaking about the murder of Sheryl Stack. But apparently, there's another death row inmate with the same claims. Both will come across a few big names from the city, with one of them being James Henry Rohn, a member of the infamous Newtown gang. He was convicted of 3 capital murders and sent to Virginia's death row. And just to be clear, the information that comes next is considered word of mouth. Words that specifically came from Henry himself. He says that Mark Sheppard told him the same story when they were in the prison recreation yard, and Henry tried encouraging Mark to tell authorities the truth about Andre, saying, and I quote, "Well, you know this man ain't do it. You should cut him loose. Only you can do that." But instead, Mark stuck to the story that Andre had snitched to the police on him, which was assumed to be the reason why he kept quiet about it. It was further thought that Mark never told authorities that Andre was not the gunman because he hoped to somehow beat the death sentence he faced for the Rosenbluth case. And due to the fast track law, which increased the number of federal crimes that were punishable by death, Mark's execution was to come a year before Andre's. So Henry and the other inmates all expected Mark to say it on the gurney on the way to his execution, to take blame for it, but he didn't, literally taking it to his grave on January 20th of 1999. Anti-death penalty groups would hold a rally outside the state capitol in Richmond, asking the General Assembly to end capital punishment in Virginia. Signs and banners that read, "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind," or "Violence is not the answer." It was a dark, cloudy, and rainy day as Mark's mother, Thelma Thompson, spoke at the rally with about 3 dozen activists watching her plead for her son's life. "I feel sorry for the other families. They lost their children too, but taking his life is not going to help. Executing my son is not going to bring them back. But none of the members of the General Assembly attended the rally. The protesters carrying candles would stand outside the prison's main gate until Mark's execution was over. And it was 11 months later, on December 12th of 1999, that Andre Graham would meet the same fate.
I would give them the advice that don't be ashamed to ask for help. Don't think people gonna volunteer themselves like that, because they're not. You gotta put yourself there. So if you ain't getting it from your family, try to get it somewhere, but don't turn to the street for it, because that might be your last way to go. Learn how to pray to our Heavenly Father, because that's the answer.
If you could have had that last sit down before his execution, what would you say to him? What would be your last words to him?
I love you and God love you. And I know how things looked or seemed. It's already been set for you, but look at it as one of those things that I want this to be a lesson to others, because you got to get something out of it. You just can't die and nothing was learned from it. You're a dog, you're a trooper. I'm always keep your name in my mouth. But just remember, let this be an example. And if you had time, you can try to write a book or whatever, but I'm gonna still spread your story regardless. And peace and blessings, you know.
That's real.